An attention-grabbing opener, a winter secret no one expected in the first 15 seconds. Imagine this, an object so simple that villagers walked past it every day without a second thought. Yet during the darkest winters of World War II, it quietly saved thousands of families from freezing to death. It wasn't a new invention, not cutting-edge technology, and it didn't require a single extra stick of firewood. It was hay, and what those families knew about it is almost forgotten by modern households. Today we will explore a forgotten survival technique that worked effectively when nations collapsed, when fuel disappeared, and winter punished every mistake. This isn't folklore, it's functional physics that kept people truly alive. And if you understand it, you can apply it immediately in your own home, cabin, or off-grid shelter. Now let's begin. In the harshest winters of war, entire regions in Europe faced a brutal problem. Fuel reserves were confiscated, transport routes destroyed, and even well-prepared households saw their woodpiles dwindle long before spring. In that crisis, survival didn't belong to the strongest, but to those who still remembered the knowledge passed down by their grandparents. They turned to something humble, abundant, and overlooked, and they used it in a way that modern science today perfectly understands. Hay became a shield, a thermal armor, a barrier against cold, so effective that families using it burned significantly less firewood than those who didn't. And the deeper you look into this method, the more you realize it was never luck, but skill, observation, and a quiet mastery of heat that modern insulation companies never talk about. What we're about to discover is the forgotten trick with hay, turning simple hay into one of the most reliable heating tools ever used. And once you hear how it works, you'll understand exactly why this technique still deserves a place in today's world. 2. Why we are forced to return to ancient knowledge. As World War II swept across Europe, it didn't just destroy cities, it destroyed stability. The military demanded wood to build bunkers, railways, and trenches, and governments rationed fuel so severely that many rural families entered winter with only half their usual reserves. In Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, and northern Scandinavia, temperatures dropped far below freezing while chimneys burned weaker than ever. People weren't just cold, they were desperate. But in this desperation, something remarkable reappeared: the elderly villagers. Recalling methods used long before fiberglass or mineral wool factories, they remembered how their parents survived winter when insulation simply did not exist. And they turned again to hay, a resource that continually appears after every harvest, regardless of whatever war is raging. It was freely available, unaffected by supply chains, and perfectly suited for one purpose: slowing the escape of precious warmth. Interestingly, this was not an act of invention, but an inevitable act based on memory. An instinctive return to principles had silently kept pioneer families alive for centuries, and by rediscovering them, we gained an advantage that modern households rarely consider. They didn't try to fight winter with just fire, but they fought by preventing heat loss from the start. This shift in thinking is one of the greatest lessons on why winter survival when resources dwindle. You don't win by burning more. You win by protecting what you already have, and hay allowed families to do exactly that. 3. The hidden scientific clues. In everyday farm life, long before scientists studied R values and thermal conductivity, farmers observed something that puzzled them. On nights when temperatures dropped to dangerous levels, animals buried in hay remained warm enough to survive without barns or stoves. Root cellars insulated with straw maintained stable temperatures across seasons, and simple farm sheds filled with hay often felt warmer inside than well-built log cabins. This was not coincidence. They were field experiments, repeated year after year across mountains, plains, and war-ravaged countryside. Throughout that time, families recorded these observations in diaries from Poland, Hungary, and the Carpathian Mountains. They described cows surviving blizzards by burrowing into haystacks, and vegetables, not freezing, while everything else turned brittle with frost. What they were witnessing, without scientific terminology, was the physics of trapped air. Each stalk of hay created tiny pockets, resisting the movement of heat, turning a loose material into a powerful, insulating barrier. And once people saw this effect in their barns and cellars, awareness came naturally. If hay could preserve the warmth of animal bodies, if it could protect food through months of cold, then surely it could also protect humans. This single insight turned hay from a simple farm material into a strategic survival tool during one of the harshest periods of modern history. And the best part, the same principle still works today, exactly as it did 80 years ago. 4. Cold weather physics turned hay into a silent savior. When winter tightens its grip, the rules of survival change. Heat becomes a form of currency, and every household must decide whether to use it wastefully or conserve it with discipline. Families have used straw for centuries. We understand this instinctively, even if they never used scientific terms. What they were really building was a thermal barrier. Based on a simple fact, cold moves quickly through solid materials, but slows down significantly. When it has to fight through layers of trapped air, dry straw with its loose structure is filled with tiny air pockets. Each air pocket disrupts the movement of heat, forcing it to bounce back, stall, and weaken as it tries to escape. Modern engineers call this thermal resistance. Farmers simply call it warm enough to survive. This is why a small stove in a house, insulated with straw, can heat a room for hours, longer than in a typical cabin. The warmth doesn't leak away, but is retained. Throughout, this principle has been tested in harsh conditions. In Belarus and northern Ukraine, villages built temporary winter shelters against the walls of their homes. They packed straw tightly into every corner. The passing soldiers later noted a strange thing. Even when the outdoor temperature dropped below 20 degrees, the interiors of these straw-insulated structures were significantly warmer, sometimes by 8 to 12 degrees. That difference could be the line between frostbite and safety, between waking up cold and not waking up at all. And this is the modern lesson. Many of us today focus on generating more heat. Bigger heaters, stronger stoves, higher energy bills. But the way people learned what many homeowners today overlook. You don't survive winter by burning more fire. You survive by slowing the loss of the heat you've already paid for. Straw isn't magic. It's physics applied with absolute clarity. 5. 3 techniques Europeans used to turn straw into winter defense during war. Straw was not scattered randomly or used as a messy pile leaned against the wall. It was applied with specific methods developed over centuries of cold climates. Living climates. Each technique addressed a different weakness in the house's structure, and families chose methods that suited both their resources and the severity of the coming winter. The first technique was informally called hay banking. Families stacked straw along the outside of the house, building a thick, even wall that acts as a natural windbreak. The north and east sides, where the coldest winds blow hardest, received the most reinforcement. This simple action stabilizes the indoor temperature more than any single additional bundle of firewood. The second technique is the underfloor cavity method. Many old European houses have raised wooden floors, and freezing air would creep underneath on winter nights. By stuffing straw into those cavities, families blocked the cold at its source. Diaries from Baltic villages describe children crawling under the floor. With straw bundles, they turned a drafty room into a warm-sealed box. The third method was the most advanced, temporary double walls. Households built a lightweight wooden frame around the main house, leaving a gap of a few inches, which was then tightly packed with straw, turning the structure into a natural insulation chamber. When spring returned, the outer frame was dismantled, and the straw was reused as bedding or fertilizer. Nothing was wasted, and the house stayed warm throughout the harshest winters. What makes these techniques extraordinary is not just their simplicity, but also their replicability. Anyone could build them, anyone could maintain them, and even today, with straw bales widely available, these systems remain among the most cost-effective off-grid insulation strategies in the world. 6 maintenance secrets the modern world overlooks. One of the most surprising facts about straw insulation is that the ancients did not see it as a static material. They saw it as something alive, something that demanded attention, awareness, and a bit of discipline. This is where the difference between warm enough and dangerously cold was often decided. Throughout the process, families checked their straw regularly. They looked for moisture after storms, because even a slightly damp patch could lose up to half its insulation capacity. They replaced the outer layer if snow melted into it. They lifted the bottom of the straw a few inches off the ground to prevent moisture from wicking upward. They shook out and fluffed sections that were too compressed, restoring the air pockets that made it insulate in the first place. It was a living system, a system that rewarded attention and punished neglect. Modern homeowners often assume insulation is something you install once and forget. But those who survived Europe's coldest wartime winters understood a deeper principle. Insulation is not a product. It is a relationship between heat, air, and the materials that keep them in place. When you care for that relationship, even simple straw becomes a powerful shield. When you neglect it, even the best modern materials can fail. And here is another lasting lesson. Low-tech systems are not inferior. They just require engagement. The straw trick worked because families respected the physics behind it. And if you apply that same mindset today, checking moisture, blocking drafts, protecting warm air, you'll discover, as they did, that staying warm has less to do with how much fuel you burn, and it depends even more on how well you retain heat. 7. Wartime figures. Shock. Modern homeowners. As war drags on and winter grows harsher, governments across Europe quietly collected data on how civilians survived the cold with almost no fuel. What they found still surprises researchers today. Families who insulated their homes with straw consistently burned 40 to 50% less firewood, compared to households relying on traditional heating alone. That wasn't a minor efficiency gain, it was a life-saving margin. In some parts of Czechoslovakia, inspectors reported that homes with straw-insulated walls stayed warm all night, with just one evening stove firing, while neighboring homes needed 2 or 3 fuel refills to maintain the same temperature. In rural Austria, records show straw insulation retained the heat of a dying fire so well that embers were still usable the next morning. This meant less wood chopping, less foraging, and more importantly, less danger for men at risk of being caught outdoors in the cold, or by wartime patrols. These numbers painted a clear picture. The straw trick wasn't a minor convenience. It was a decisive factor in whether a family could stretch their fuel through the winter. And here's what modern homeowners rarely consider. Most heating systems fail not because they produce too little heat, but because they lose too much heat. A poorly insulated home is like a bucket with holes. It doesn't matter how fast you fill it, if everything leaks out. People back then understood this intuitively. They didn't have the luxury of waste. Every ember counted, and straw helped them hold on to every bit of warmth they could generate. This is why the straw pile is still worth attention today. It proves that the most powerful way to survive winter is not consumption, but conservation. And that is a lesson as relevant in our age of soaring energy costs as it was in the darkest winters of the 1940s. 8. Why this technique disappeared after the war. With so much success and so many lives saved, why did the straw method fade from memory? The answer has little to do with performance, and everything to do with perception. As the war ended, nations threw themselves into industrial reconstruction. Factories resumed production. Modern insulation materials, fiberglass, mineral wool, and later foam boards, became symbols of progress. Government standardized building codes and encouraged people to upgrade to industrially produced materials. Anything homemade or agricultural was quietly pushed aside, deemed outdated or unhygienic. Families who had survived the war wanted to move forward, not backward. They associated straw with hardship. With cold winters marked by fear and scarcity, when prosperity returned, even effective low-tech methods were abandoned, in favor of sleek materials neatly packaged in bags and rolls. Over time, the wisdom of storing straw became a forgotten chapter in the history of survival. But here's the irony. Modern insulation relies on that very principle that made straw so effective, slowing heat transfer by trapping air. Today, companies spend millions to replicate what simple plant fibers achieved for free. Yet, because straw isn't shiny, uniform, or industrially produced, it hasn't regained the respect it deserves. This is a powerful reminder for anyone preparing for future uncertainty. Sometimes the best solutions aren't new, they're just forgotten. And when supply chains fail or energy systems falter, techniques considered crude often become the most reliable. We have straw. It never stopped working. We just stopped paying attention. Modern science confirms what our farmers knew. In the past 2 decades, researchers of natural building materials have rediscovered something remarkable. When dry grass and straw are kept dry, their insulation performance matches or even surpasses many commercial products. The reason is the same as why families relied on millions of tiny air pockets held in a lightweight, breathable structure. Lab tests measuring thermal resistance. The famous R-value shows that compressed straw bales reach levels equivalent to fiberglass bats. Even loose straw, when properly layered, reduces heat loss significantly. Ecological architects have used straw bale construction to build homes that stay warm in winter and cool in summer, all while using a fraction of the energy of conventional designs. This material is renewable, carbon sequestering, and biodegradable. In other words, it's everything modern insulation tries to imitate. More importantly, modern experiments echo wartime experiences. In off-grid cabins and rural homes, people today often report a 20 to 30% reduction in heating needs, simply by stacking straw or hay along their coldest exterior walls. Others use straw to insulate chicken coops, greenhouses, or emergency shelters, and the temperature difference is immediately noticeable. What our farmers learned from necessity, modern builders are validating with spreadsheets, sensors, and thermal cameras, and the conclusion is always the same. Straw works. It worked 80 years ago. It worked 200 years ago, and it will work tomorrow. The past has not lost its relevance. We have simply drifted away from the skills that once helped ordinary families survive winters far harsher than most of us will ever face. 10 ways to apply this technique today, safely, cheaply, and immediately. If you are wondering how this forgotten wartime method fits into the modern world, the answer is simple. It fits everywhere, whether you live in a log cabin, a small farm, a suburban house with drafty walls, or even a weekend off-grid shelter. The principles that kept families warm in the 1940s are still applicable today. With nearly zero cost to start, identify the coldest sides of your house in the northern hemisphere, which are usually the north and west walls, where the winter wind blows strongest. By stacking bales of straw or hay tightly along those exterior walls, you create an instant thermal barrier, slowing heat loss significantly. This single step often reduces energy usage without touching your heater at all. For extra protection, place a simple plank or tarp on top of the bales to prevent rain or snow from wetting them. Dry hay is a powerful insulator, wet hay is not. If you live in a building with a raised floor, you can take inspiration from Baltic households. During wartime, they stuffed hay into the cavities under floorboards to prevent cold air from rising. That is the kind of low-effort improvement that can change the temperature of a room overnight. And if you want to take this method to the highest level, consider the temporary winter wall, an idea perfected by families in Finland and Latvia under wartime pressure. Build a light frame a few inches outside the existing wall, fill the gap with hay, and seal the top to prevent moisture. You have just created a removable insulated chamber that can compete with commercial materials without buying a single roll of fiberglass. When spring comes, simply disassemble it. The hay becomes garden mulch, animal bedding, or compost. Nothing goes to waste. That is the beauty of the hay bale method. It is not only effective, but also flexible, recyclable, and feasible for anyone willing to understand the science behind it. In a world where energy bills keep rising, this old method offers something rare, immediate results without long-term expense. 11. Why this knowledge matters in the uncertain future ahead. The same pressures that made hay insulation indispensable during wartime are quietly re-emerging in our era. Energy prices keep climbing, winters become more unpredictable, power outages occur unexpectedly, and modern heating systems depend on a fragile grid that can fail in a storm. The truth is simple. Resilience is once again becoming essential. It is not luxury. Low-tech methods like straw insulation provide the stability that the modern world lacks. They do not depend on electricity, factories, long transport routes, or digital systems. They require no specialized tools, and, unlike many modern products, they do not fail catastrophically. Straw does not suddenly lose all its effectiveness because a part burns out or a circuit breaks. It remains reliable because its strength comes from physics, not technology. There is a deeper reason why this knowledge matters. Straw insulation reminds us that survival is not about having the most advanced equipment, but about understanding the natural materials around us, using them wisely, and realizing that simple solutions are often more effective than complex ones. As the world becomes unstable, as communities explore renewable energy, off-grid living, and emergency preparedness, the straw trick serves as a reminder that we already have many of the tools we need. We just need to remember how to use them. And when the next fuel shortage occurs, or when a winter storm brings down the power grid, households that know these techniques will stay warm, not because they consume more, but because they understand more. 12. Conclusion. One final lesson from winters that have tested humanity. If there is one message to take from this forgotten method, it is this. The past is not a museum of outdated ideas, but a library of proven solutions, tested under conditions harsher than most of us have ever faced. Those families who lived through those winters were not lucky, nor were they protected by modern technology. They were protected by knowledge. Quiet, simple, enduring knowledge found in barns, in fields, and in the observations of daily life. Straw was never just bedding for animals. It was a thermal weapon, a shield against the cold, a material that turned humble houses into shelters that could withstand winter without expensive fuel or advanced tools. And that understanding still holds value today. When systems fail, when resources run out, when nature becomes unpredictable, your greatest advantage is not machinery, but memory. So if this discovery helps you rediscover a piece of forgotten survival technique, share it, pass it on, talk about it with someone who values practical wisdom and the resilience of the old world, because history lives only as long as we choose to remember it, and the winters of the past still have lessons to teach, lessons that might one day warm your home when you need them most.